Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today, we're entering the world of Hereward Carrington. If you got a chance to listen to the episode called The Ancient Science of Breathing, I read some excerpts from Hereward Carrington, who was a well-known British-born American investigator of psychic phenomena. He was a great author. He wrote hundreds of books on the paranormal and psychical research, and would go after mediums and question certain fakers. But he wrote about yoga and the Kundalini, and there is an incredible passage in his book, The Higher Psychical Development, that talks about the Kundalini. And it has two chapters. First, how it's aroused, and then it discusses how this enters into the fourth dimension. Combined, they're amazing. We've read the section on pranayama in that episode, but this is so mind-blowing. I wanted to dedicate a separate episode to it. I have had a Kundalini experience, and I've had many people contact me who have experienced Kundalini type events through my meditations. And there's questions about how this works. Some people have a very mild Kundalini type experience and they think nothing happens. And some people don't understand exactly what it means. If you've experienced it, I believe it's talked about by Neville Goddard and a variety of different authors. It is a sort of secret energy that, when aroused, changes you and your mind and your body. And I believe it's part of this process that we're going through as we move to the new earth, or the fourth density, the fourth dimension. And Hereward Carrington went to India and really researched a lot of the old yoga texts, and he did a really good job of summarizing it for the Western audience at the time. And so I've learned a lot from it. It's a little easier to understand than some of the more esoteric texts. The Kundalini and how it is aroused. The last chapter dealt with the attainment of the ultimate stages of consciousness desired by the yogi, the attainment of samadhi through dhyana, the unification of the mind with the absolute. Everyone is, however, interested in phenomena. I've always noticed that in a lecture accompanied by demonstrations, most people tolerate the lecture for the sake of the demonstrations. And I suppose it is the same with yoga, although, as a matter of fact, all through these practices which one undertakes in yoga, one obtains all kinds of phenomena of interesting psychological character, not spiritistic and not supernormal invariably, but interesting psychological inner experiences which are real. We now come to an offshoot of these experiments, so to say, in which we shall delve more particularly into the direct experimental production of phenomena by means of the yoga methods. Before doing so, it will be necessary to say a few words regarding the constitution of man, according to the Hindu conceptions. The ordinary Western view of man is that he has a physical body, and that somewhere inside this concealed a spirit or mind or soul or something, a very vague idea, and that this mind works and thinks and constitutes the real man, and that beyond this there's some spirit or vapor or shadow or wraith, which he calls a soul, which somehow inherits the kingdom of heaven. But what the connections between mind, spirit, and soul are have always been very vague in our Western minds. Now, the Hindu idea is that man is made up much more complexly than this. To begin with, man has 7 bodies, and the lowest of these is the physical body, the gross body they call it. That above this there is the etheric body. This is also, of course, the theosophical doctrine, which is borrowed from the Hindus. And above that, there is the astral body, and then the mental body, and so on, through the higher planes above the mental. Each of these bodies acts as a sort of link, or intermediary, between the one above and the one below. For instance, the etheric constitutes the link or connection between the astral and the physical, and the astral constitutes the link between the mental and the etheric, and so on. I've already mentioned very briefly the subject of insanity, the fact that there is a connection or link between the mind and the body, and that many forms of insanity are due not to fundamental diseases of the body or to fundamental disorders of the mind, but to the link between the two being out of order. These bodies then all function on their own particular planes, and there are as many planes as there are bodies, or rather there are as many bodies as there are planes, each functioning in its own plane. The physical body functions on the physical plane, the mental body on the mental plane, the etheric body on the etheric plane, and so on. Now the Hindus have an idea that energy, as it were, plays down on matter from above, which I also believe to be fundamentally true, although matter, in a sense, is alive, in the sense that it is in constant motion, rapid motion, also that it has a sort of innate consciousness of its own. There's also another consciousness which is added to it when that becomes organized or bound together, and that this is due to the fact that there is a playing upon the material substratum of this energy from, as it were, above. The Hindus have worked out a very elaborate theory of evolution on this principle, the outpouring of the divine breath, and other things which we cannot go into now. At any rate, this fact that we can draw on an inexhaustible supply, a source of mental and physical energy, seems experimentally demonstrated to us by our practical daily lives and by common experience. For instance, a woman of my acquaintance took some morphine for a minor operation, and under the influence of this morphine, read through in one day 3 books of a heavy character, and remembered practically every word of those 3 books. Take another drug, cocaine, and you experience extraordinary happiness, but the happiness you experience is not in the cocaine. It does not exist in the little white powder. It is in the human being, and the drug simply brings it up to the surface, so that you evidently have these extraordinarily latent capacities for happiness, of memory, for all these extraordinary powers within yourself, and they have to be brought to the surface by some artificial means in order for you to acquire them. Hypnotism does this. It brushes away the obstacles of thought and all body suppressions, all those factors within ourselves which keep repressing us all the time. And it allows these inner, inexhaustible stores and possibilities to come to the surface. William James has an essay entitled The Energies of Men, and he shows in this very illuminating essay that we use only a small fraction of the energies within ourselves. There is also this curious physiological fact which very few people know, vis-a-vis that the baby, even before it is born, possesses as many brain cells as it ever will. We do not add brain cells, we merely develop them or bring them into useful activity, layer on layer, as we go through life. And no matter how far we may develop our minds or our brains, we may get to the point where we use all those cells, so that you need never be afraid of exhausting your own powers. We always have a reserve physiologically. These extraordinary mental heights, these mental powers, these latent energies, this happiness and joy and bliss, as the Hindus are always saying, expressing combinations of emotions and feelings and thoughts, can thus be attained artificially through drugs or by experimental methods such as hypnosis, and also can be attained by a species of mental work within oneself. In these yoga practices, and when you attain this state of samadhi, you arrive at that state in which you experience this bliss. Then you unlock automatically all these energies and powers within yourself, and you attain them at the moment of attaining cosmic consciousness. The Hindus, however, make a very clear distinction between the kinds of liberation or ecstasy which may be produced by means of drugs, on the one hand, and meditation, on the other. Thus we read, Ananda, bliss of a kind may be secured through drink or drugs, but no one supposes that this is liberating bliss. This shows us how thoroughly the Hindu psychology took such states of being into account and studied them, The spirit of man is divided by the Hindus into 5 categories, and symbolically they always use elements to express them in much the same way that the alchemists did. There is the pure spirit of Atma. Then they say there is the air, which is manas, i.e. the mind or thought faculty. Fire, which is buddhi, the discriminating faculty. Water, which is chitta, or thought stuff. And earth, which is ahankara, or egoity, you might say. There are, you will see, certain qualities of spirit believed in by the Hindus, which are very similar, namely manas and chitta, that is, thought and thought stuff. How do they differ? The Hindus say they differ in the same way that water differs from the motion of water. One is a quiescent state, the other is the same thing in motion. Incidentally, I may say here that in the West there is great controversy as to whether a thing is the same thing at rest as it is in motion. For instance, the human mind. The consciousness is a thing or a go. Is it an entity, or is it something which only exists while it is moving in action? And then, when that action stops, does the thing itself go out of existence? Another school says anything that moves must be something to move, and so on. To return, however, this internal instrument of the mind has 5 sheaths, or kosas, namely the body of bliss, the thought sheath, the consciousness sheath, the fire sheath, and the body of nourishment. This last is supposed to feed or draw nutriment from the 5 tattvas or ethers. In addition to these are also the 3 lower bodies, the causal body, the subtle body, and the gross body. The Hindus write a great deal about these tattvas or ethers, but before going into them I must say a word regarding our Western conception of ether. Most of us think of the ether as a vague, tenuous, vaporous thing which is so thin and so tenuous that no instrument has ever registered it, which is a fact. Some people even doubt its existence. On the contrary, Sir Oliver Lodge believes that it is so enormously dense and solid that platinum and gold are as nothing to it. In his book, The Ether of Space, he defends this view. The sun and the earth, he says, or the earth and the moon, by the force of gravity, exert an enormous pull on each other. There must be something which keeps them apart. What is that something? It must be the ether. And he has calculated, for instance, that the pull of the earth on the moon is something like 5 million pillars of steel, each a square foot thick, which would be equivalent to the force which the ether transmits between these 2 bodies. On the contrary, Haeckel, in his Riddle of the Universe, thought that the ether was the traditional gas, so to say, and calculated that a globe or sphere of ether the size of the earth would weigh about 250 pounds. So there is a great difference of opinion, and as I have said, some physicists are even inclined to believe that the ether does not exist at all. This is the new school of relativism, who hold the doctrine of relativity. Just a word regarding this may be of interest, because it has caused quite a stir in the scientific world, and that as you are moving and everything else is moving, there is nothing stable in the universe from which we can get a stationary point of observation, as it were. The analogy which has been used is that you are on a moving ship and you observe someone walking on another moving ship. You cannot calculate his actual motion, because in addition to all the motions of the boats, the earth is moving on its axis, and the axis of the earth wobbles, and the earth is moving through space around the sun at a definite rate, about 19 miles a second, and the whole solar system, our sun and all, is traveling through space at a certain rate towards a distant star. And perhaps all this is moving further into space, so that you can never get to a final point of stationariness. Everything in the universe is moving, and that being the case, this doctrine of relativity says that everything is relative. There is, of course, much more to be said of the doctrine than this, but the above will serve our present purposes. Now, this ether, according to modern science, Western science, is thought to be one thing, one ether, whatever it is, which conveys light rays, and this is why it has been called luminiferous ether, because lumen equals light. Sound, however, is thought to be conveyed through the air, whereas sound travels at ordinary temperatures and pressures only about 1,100 feet a second. Light travels at the rate of electricity, 186,000 miles a second. The Hindus believe there are numbers of ethers, and that there is an ether for each of the senses. They have these names: luminous ether, conveying light; sonophorous ether, for conveying sound; tangiferous ether, for conveying the sense of touch; gustiferous ether, for the sense of taste; and odoriferous ether, for the sense of smell. We know that in a vacuum, where there is no air, sound is not conveyed and heat is not conveyed, and so we think that air is the medium for conveying heat and sound, and that no ethers at all are connected with touch or with taste. But the Hindus do, and they account for these things by various subtle theories which we cannot enter into here. However, these tattvas or ethers are thought to be modifications of the great breath, which is a sort of fundamental primal energy which the Hindus believe in, and this acts upon the prakriti. The great breath flows in 5 streams, the different tattvas. These tattvas or ethers have different shapes. Some of them are in the form of triangles, some in squares, some in loops, some are like scallops, and some take other shapes. They also have different movements. The special operation of each of the tattvas is located at its individual center in the microcosm. Says Avalon, prana in the body of the individual is a part of the universal breath, or the great breath. An attempt, therefore, is made to harmonize the individual breath with the cosmic or collective breath. Strength and health are thereby attained. The regulation of the harmonized breath helps to the regulation and steadiness of the mind, and therefore concentration. The Serpent Power, pages 212 to 213. Now, the prana, which we discussed in our chapter on pranayama, is the energy of our universe. This is the state of tattvic or etheric energy in which our universe dwells. There are currents of this running north and south, and east and west, throughout the universe, and there are also currents of this prana in the body. These currents are inhaled and exhaled and circulated throughout the body in our breathing exercises when we practice pranayama, and we must learn to absorb this prana, retain it, and send it through the body, in particular to the certain centers in the body where we wish to utilize this energy for vivifying purposes. This is a very important point which the Hindus have dealt with and dwelt upon, and it is the crux of their whole experimental system. This direction of the prana or energy to certain centers, the seat of the prana, is said to be the heart or chest, as it were pervading the whole chest from the heart, and thence it spreads all over the body. There seems to be a sort of uncertainty or vagueness about the Hindu teachings as to whether this prana is spread by the nerves as we conceive nerves. But in any case, they call these prana carriers the nadis. And later we will come to something which is called the voice of the nada, which is very mysterious. Here is a quotation from a Sanskrit writer showing the doctrine regarding these nadis. From the heart ramify the nadis. Of these there are 101 principal ones. Each of these branches into 100, and each of these again into 72,000. Thus there are 10,000 branch nadis, and 727,200,000 of their smaller ones. Altogether, taking into account other main nadis, which we will come to, there are 727,210,201. If you take a knife and dissect a human body, you do not find these nadis. You do not find all the various centers we will come to later on. But it must be remembered here that the Hindus were always supposed to be a psychic nation. We're supposed to possess psychic sight, a certain amount of clairvoyance, and they say no. This matter which is talked about, these psychic centers, these ramifying nadis, are astral matter, not physical matter. Therefore, you won't find them by the aid of a knife. Yet they exist. They are part of the body. Says Avalon, the term nerve is used for default of another equivalent. These nadis, called yoga nadis, are not, like the nadis of physiology, gross things, but subtle lines in which the life force works in bodies. Some are gross nadis, such as the physical nerves, veins, and arteries, known to medical science. But they exist in subtle forms, and are then known as yoga nadis. The latter may be described as a subtle channel of pranic energy. The Serpent Power, pages 115 and 130. Enormous importance is attached by the Hindus to the process of cleansing the nadis by proper pranic breathing exercises. As Avalon says, months or years may be spent in the preliminary process of cleansing the nadis. So we come now to the heart and root of the whole Eastern doctrine of the development of psychic powers. It depends upon a very secret and ancient doctrine which has been given only in the Sanskrit and never written out in detail, but always passed on by word of mouth from master to pupil. It is the most secret of all the teachings of the Hindu school. It is the doctrine of the Kundalini. And it is upon the awakening of this sacred Kundalini or secret energy that all these powers depend. Madame Blavatsky says Kundalini is called the serpentine or amular power on account of its spiral working or progress in the body of the ascetic developing the power in himself. It is an electric, fiery, occult, or phohatic power, the great pristine force which underlies all organic and inorganic matter. In order to understand how this operates, we must understand still further the inner constitution of the body. Up the interior of the spine, in the marrow, as it were, there is said to exist a tube, a hollow tube, which is called the Sushumna. And it is up this Sushumna that the Kundalini passes. The Kundalini itself is symbolized by a snake having 3.5 coils. From this, you will now see the importance of keeping the spine straight, as we so often insisted in speaking of asana, bodily posture. The object, of course, is to awaken this Kundalini, this serpent of fire, of life, and to send it, direct it, the energy that is, through certain centers of the body, one after the other in turn. These centers in the body are called chakras or lotuses. The Hindus are very fond of the lotus, and they say that these chakras look like lotus flowers, having a certain number of petals, and in the ordinary human being, these psychic centers are stationary, that is, immovable. They are also variously colored. With their awakening or vivification, however, you acquire clairvoyance and clairaudience, and numbers of other psychic powers to be enumerated later. When they are awakened, they will begin to glow with a certain color or colors, and also to spin, like a spinning wheel. These chakras have a certain number of petals. Speaking of these petals, Mr. Avalon remarks, in the Indian system, the total number of the petals correspond with the number of the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, and the number of the petals of any specific lotus is determined by the disposition of the nadis around it. These petals further bear subtle sound powers and are 50 in number, as are the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. We now come to a very difficult and subtle question, namely the so-called Sanskrit letters on the petals of the various lotuses, the garland of letters. If one studies the illustration of the chakras, one finds that upon the petals are certain Sanskrit letters, a letter on each petal. In the centers are also geometrical figures, animals, purely symbolical. Now, these letters are not supposed to be really there in the sense that they are physically written upon the petals, because the petals themselves, as we have seen, are not physical in that sense. The letters and the sounds they typify are purely symbolic, but just what this symbolism means, it is often extremely difficult to discover. Arthur Avalon, in his work, The Serpent Power, has examined the various theories at length, and the student is referred to his book for details. Suffice it to say here that the letters may be said to represent powers, which powers are qualities of the lotuses, and that these powers are represented by the letters standing for mantras connected with the chakras. They represent only the ideas of men. These centers correspond in the physical body to the principal nerve plexuses, the cardiac, the solar, etc., while the chakra between the eyebrows corresponds to the pineal gland in the brain. It must be emphasized, however, that this correspondence is only symbolical, as the centers themselves are not physical, nor in the physical body. It must always be borne in mind that these chakras or centers are not physical things. though they are often spoken of as though they were. Mr. Ledbetter speaks of them as composed of astral or etheric matter, while the traditional Hindu teachings seem to indicate they are more nearly psychic centers, pure and simple. Thus, the lotuses are centers of universal consciousness. These chakras are differing centers of consciousness, vitality, and tattvic energy. Each of the 5 lower chakras is the center of energy, of a gross tattva, i.e. of that form of tattvic activity which manifests sensible matter. The 6th is the center of the subtle mental tattva. The first is the Muladhara chakra, which is situated at the base of the spine. This lotus has 4 petals, and it is here that the Kundalini sleeps, in 3.5 coils curled up. Its tail is in its mouth. The sacred symbol and its remains at rest at the entrance of the Sushumna, but it does not penetrate it or arise through it until awakened. When it does, it passes up the Sushumna, or the spine, to vivify the various chakras. Till then, it has remained at rest. Now, on either side of the Sushumna, or tube, are 2 other tubes known as Ida and Pingala, which lie, as I have said, on either side of the Sushumna tube. A great deal has been said and written to prove that the mystical tree of life spoken of in the book of Genesis is connected with this Kundalini, because when it is awakened, you then have psychic powers. And it was in this wrong awakening of the power of life, this extraordinary energy and the knowledge that it brings, which was wrongly awakened by some being called Adam. That accounts for the legend of the serpent, which is the serpent fire Kundalini. The whole Genesis legend, according to the Oriental view, is merely a way of symbolizing the awakening of the Kundalini force. In Le Comte de Gabalis, a mystical treatise, is a paragraph dealing with the allegory of Eve and the serpent and its relation to the Kundalini force. Allegory of Eve and the serpent. The primordial electricity or solar force, semi-latent within the aura of every human being, was known to the Greeks as the spirima, the serpent coil, and in the Upanishads, the sacred writings of India, it is said to be coiled up like a slumbering serpent. In the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis, it is symbolized as the serpent, more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. Eve, when this force stirred within her, was tempted to its misapplication, directed downward through the lower physical centers for generation, unhallowed by a consciousness of responsibility to God and the incoming soul. The serpent force, or fire, brought knowledge of evil, directed upward through the brain of regeneration, the formation of the deathless solar body. It brought knowledge of good. Hence, the dual operation of the solar force is symbolized as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The curse of the Lord upon the serpent makes reference to the fact that during a certain period of human evolution, man shall remain in ignorance of the law governing the serpent, or solar force, which shall manifest in man's lower or earthly vehicles misgoverned by the human mind. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise its heel. During the above-mentioned cycle of evolution, in his ignorance of the law governing the serpent of fire, man shall continually direct it downward or bruise its head, while the serpent fire, thus misdirected, shall bruise man's heel, heel being a euphemism for that part of man nearest the earth, that is to say, the body, lower emotions, and mortal mind. And the Lord said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. Here, the tree of life symbolizes the upward play of the solar force for the creation of the deathless or solar body. Hence, the meaning is, lest man should learn the law governing solar force and directing it upward become immortal. Now, this energy, this extraordinarily fundamental energy in the body, is very closely connected with the creative energies, the sex energies of the body. The body is vivified by this energy, and it is utilized for certain purposes. The doctrine of our Western Church is based largely on asceticism, but I think it has become twisted by a perverted view of the older teachings. Scholars went to the East, and they saw certain holy men who performed remarkable feats. They also saw that these men were ascetics, and they said, he is an ascetic. He can do these wonderful things. He is a holy man. Therefore, asceticism is the cause of this. And they taught it, but they did not perceive or know that this energy was utilized or directed into certain channels, psychic channels, and that unless this is done, the whole point of asceticism is lost. You must either use up the sex energies of the body in healthful exercises and activities, or in their normal channels of expression, or through these psychic avenues. And if you do not expand them in any one of those three ways, then you have curious mental and physical troubles, perversions and abnormalities, and so forth. The medieval ascetics had a twisted view of the whole subject. Apropos this energy, there is an interesting analogy of which I have often thought. It is that in many spontaneous psychic cases, poltergeist cases, we call them, in which furniture is thrown about, bells rung, and crockery broken without apparent cause, nearly always a girl or a boy between 12 and 15 years of age is the author of the phenomena. The spontaneous outburst of these phenomena is, I am sure, associated with the awakening of the sex energies at that time, which find this curious method of externalization. For example, there lived a girl in Paris about the middle of the last century, Angelique Cotton, who was called the Electric Girl. Wherever she went in the house, the furniture followed her about and fell over, and of course the family called in the local police. The police investigated and tried to stop the manifestations, threatened her, and so forth. However, the phenomena developed and kept up for nearly a year. They finally stopped, and nothing more was heard of them. In 9 cases out of 10, you will find that these spontaneous poltergeist cases are connected with young people of about that age, and I am sure there is a definite energy connection between the two. To come back to the Muladhara, lotus or chakra at the base of the spine, the first of the 7, in Muladhara is also said to dwell a sun between 4 petals, which exudes a poison, and this is said to be the sun fluid of mortality or death, and this flow upwards and ultimately arrives at the right nostril, where it mingles with the moon fluid of immortality, which goes to the left nostril of Pingala. And we have the sun and moon there united in a form of symbolism, which we shall come to presently in discussing another of the chakras. The Muladhara chakra is said to be the center of the body, in the sense that it is a subtle center, the center of its psychical and spiritual power. On its 4 petals are, of course, 4 Sanskrit letters, 1 on each petal, and in its center a form of tattva or etheric energy. Like all the chakras, it hangs head downward until aroused or vivified by the Kundalini passing through it. When it turns upward like a flower to the sun, this and all the other centers, it must be remembered, are in the Sushumna and not in the body proper. And the Sushumna is in the spinal cord to the extent that it can be said to be in space at all. The second chakra is called the Svadhisthana chakra. It is situated at the base of the sexual organ. It consists of 6 petals and is blood red. The 6 letters on the 6 petals of this lotus are like lightning. Water is the tattva of this chakra. While said to lie at the base of the sexual organ, it is of course the Sushumna, like all the other chakras. The third chakra is the Manipura and is located in the center of the body just below the solar plexus. It is a golden color, has 10 petals or sometimes 12 according to different authorities, and is called the City of Gems. When this center is awakened, you become clairvoyant. Apropos, this is very curious that many clairvoyants claim they can see with the stomach or the solar plexus, which is where the chakra is situated. It is said that by raising Kundalini Shakti to the Manipura center, power may be acquired over fire, and Arthur Avalon, in his book The Serpent Power, gives an instance of fire having been kindled in his own house merely by the power of mantra. On the other hand, immunity from fire, such as the medium Didi Home apparently enjoyed, is accounted for by the Hindus by the process of uniting the prana with Tejas Tattva in the navel. The Manipura chakra is said to be lustrous like a gem and is the seat of the Lord of Fire. Fourth, we have the Anatta chakra. which is situated in the heart. It is blood red, has 12 petals, and is the seat of prana. The Hindus have a saying that he who has awakened this chakra can walk in the air. That is, he experiences levitation. The mystics are supposed to have aroused this center, hence their ability to levitate. It is in the anahata chakra that the sound is heard, the pulse of life. In this center is the tree which grants all desires, and beneath it, the jeweled altar. This chakra is the critical point in yogi development. The fifth chakra is the vishuddha chakra. This is situated in the throat, just below the larynx, is of a golden color, has 16 petals, and is the seat of the akasa tattva. In the vishuddha chakra is the moon, the gateway of the great liberation. Here it is said the three forms of time are perceived. The sixth chakra is ajna, which is situated between the eyebrows. This has a connection with the pineal gland, which subject we will go into later. It has 2 petals and is supposed to possess 3 mystical principles. In the ajna chakra, the subtle tattvas of the mind reside. After the center has been awakened, the yogi henceforth receives his powers from above instead of from below. He is no longer subject to this world. In this center is the great mantra Om. An inverted yoni is also situated here. Here the tattvas of the sun, moon, and fire meet. The yogi, by meditating on this center, gains great psychic powers. It is here that the yogi places his prana at death before leaving his body. The 7th chakra, which is Sahasrara chakra, is known as the sacred 1,000-petaled lotus. There is some difference of opinion among Hindu students as to where this is located, but it is usually said to reside within the brain or outside the body altogether. And this shows you how independent of the physical body, in a sense, their physiology is. It is connected with the aura. In the center of the chakra is a yoni, with face looking downward. It is the center of this yoni is a mystical moon, continually exuding an elixir or dew. It is the moon fluid of immortality and flows through Ida. The Sahasrara chakra contains on its 1,000 petals all the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, repeated 20 times. Herein is achieved the great bliss. Shiva himself dwells therein. The yogi, who has aroused Sahasrara, is no longer subject to reincarnation. He is free from all past karma. Herein is the supreme light, the ultimate goal of yoga. In addition to these greater major chakras, there are also certain minor chakras of lesser importance. We may briefly mention the Lalana chakra, a red lotus of 12 petals situated above the Vishuddha at the root of the palate. The Mana chakra, having 6 petals closely connected with certain sensations, dreams, and hallucinations. The Soma chakra, having 16 petals whose powers are good, etc. I need not go into further details regarding these centers now for fear of confusing the reader. Interested students can find much additional material of interest concerning them in Avalon's The Serpent Power. Now, after the Kundalini is awakened, it flows up the Sushumna, darts and turns through all these various centers or chakras, animating them, causing them to glow, causing them to spin. And if the operation has been performed successfully, you see a star before the eyes, which is the sign that it has been awakened properly. Mr. C.W. Ledbetter says that 1 or 2 things may happen wrongly. In the first place, you may awaken these chakras in the wrong order. Then you have trouble. Or it may take a downward turn and animate 3 lower chakras or centers, which are known only to black magicians. This idea that chakras can be aroused in any other order than from the lowest upward shows, as Mr. Avalon points out, a misunderstanding of the specific character of the yoga. It would be physiologically impossible for Kundalini to arouse center 3 without first passing through center 2 en route. Therefore, in all cases, operation must begin at the lowest center and proceed upward as each is aroused in turn. The Kundalini, after it rises to the throat, passes down through what is called the hole of Brahman, and this plays a very important part in yoga functions or practices. The Kundalini passes up through this to the right side of the Ajna lotus, then to the left nostril where it is called the Ganges, the swift-flowing Ganges of Ida. By a modification in the opposite direction, it goes to the left side of Ajna and then to the right nostril, crossing over there where it is called Pingala, and the space between these two is called Benares, the sacred city. Probably you all know the great import that the Hindus attach to the river Ganges and to Benares, the sacred city situated on its bank. And you had thought just a curious custom, a sacred city built on a sacred river. But it is more than that. It is bound up with this doctrine, known only to the Hindus and not to the ignorant missionaries who go there. It is all a purely occult doctrine. The sacred Benares, which is the great center of attainment, symbolized in their city, and the Ganges, this river, which is the secret sacred energy which has been finally aroused and is flowing through them like a river of fire, a river of energy. Of course, as a matter of fact, the real Ganges is a filthy, dirty, germ-infected river in which natives with all kinds of diseases bathe and later on drink and thus spread plague and other diseases all over India. That is the fact. But the point is that symbolically it is bound up with this occult doctrine, and to the Hindus, of course, it is a very sacred river because of that. There is much symbolism in all this Hindu terminology. Thus, the jeweled altar is in the 8-petaled lotus below Anatta, and the Isle of Gems is the state of cosmic consciousness, or supreme ecstasy, while the so-called ocean of nectar is the infinite consciousness itself. In order to save this precious energy, then, which is thus generated within the system, the yogis endeavor to prevent the constant dripping away of this fluid, this dew, which drips down through the hole of Brahman. What they endeavor to do is to stop up this hole in the back with the tongue, and their great object is to train the tongue so they can bend it back and insert it there. And if they do this and plug up this entrance, then they think they have gained great power. And the yogis perform all kinds of curious practices in order to lengthen the tongue and make it more pliable, even cutting the thread underneath and rubbing it with salt every day and pulling it out with the fingers. All kinds of curious practices to make it long so that they can bend it back and tuck it up in this hole of Brahman, and thus prevent the dripping away of the sacred energy of this dew. This is utilized in the body and directed to the awakening of the psychic centers. These sacred energies, which are thus preserved, are called ohas and are supposed to be the most sacred of all energies. On the other hand, mind force is concentrated by the yogi name Vogabala, and in Oriental black magic, this is concentrated on the lowest center, according to the ritual of the infamous prayoga, with the result of inducing sexual hallucinations. In the so-called white or mediumistic magic, the center of energy is by the third center, the navel, for materialization phenomena, and the fifth or base of the throat center for clairaudience. Those who can reach the sixth claim the power of astral voyaging. Now, for awakening the Kundalini and getting it to perform properly, you have to begin with a certain mudras, as they are called, which are a combination of the various exercises, that is, asana and pranayama, coupled with all the mental exercises, and there are various mudras. They are called the Yoni Mudra, the Maha Mudra, the Mahabandha, the Mahaveda, the Mula Mudra, the Kachari, the Vajroli Mudra, which last is said to be the most secret and the most sacred of all, and many others. These mudras consist of combination of certain physical postures, in which the legs and feet and hands and arms and head and all parts of the body are in a certain position, with breathing exercises coupled frequently with mantras or chants, and of course intense meditation and concentration on those points where the centers are located. The breathing intakes the psychic energy or prana. The attitude facilitates the sending of it to certain points in the body, and then by will, this prana is directed to a certain spot or point, one of the chakras, until it is vivified and aroused. When it begins to glow, it begins to spin, and you have the chakra aroused by the action of the Kundalini power or force. Just an example of one or two of these mudras. Fix the gaze on ajna, between the eyes, with the tongue tucked up in the epiglottis. Then contract the throat and press the chin into the breast. Sit on the left ankle, stretch out the right leg. and take hold of the toes with the hand. Contract the throat and press the chin firmly against the breast. Now draw the breath through Sushumna. After holding the breath as long as possible, it should be exhaled very slowly so as not to expend the prana. In the celebrated Yoni Mudra, the yogi closes the eyes, ears, nostrils, and mouth with his fingers. He then forces the lips to take the shape of the beak of a crow and inhales, concentrating in turn upon the chakras. Shakti Chalana Mudra is performed by contracting the rectal muscles until a peculiar sound is heard in the Sushumna. This is usually preliminary to the Yoni Mudra. The Kachari Mudra consists in turning back the tongue into the throat as previously described with the mind fixed on ajna. The so-called bandha are really bindings and represent certain physical methods of controlling prana. A number of these processes are described at length in the Serpent Power, to which the reader is referred for further particulars. These mudras, then if practiced, arouse the Kundalini, awaken the chakras, and as they are awakened and aroused, certain psychic powers result, such as anima, which is the power of assimilating oneself with an atom; mahima, which is the power of expanding oneself in space; lagima, which is the power of reducing gravitation or levitating; gurima, which is the power of increasing one's weight, apparently adding to gravitation; prapti, which is the power of instantaneous traveling, that is, astral projection, as we here say; or prakamya, which is the power of instantaneous realization and irresistible will; or ishta, which is the power of creating by thought; or vashita, which is the power of commanding and being obeyed by beings, by animals, and by matter, so that one can move objects without contact. All these, of course, depend upon the awakening of the Kundalini. These powers are mere offshoots of that. It has, of course, been pointed out these various centers or chakras correspond in a very striking manner with the various nervous plexuses: cardiac, solar, lumbar, epigastric, cerebral. This is a very striking fact. It must never be lost sight of, however, that while this analogy or correspondence may be present, the centers themselves are not located in these various bodily plexuses, but in the Sushumna, at a point corresponding to them. Arthur Avalon points this out and insists upon it over and over again in his work, The Serpent Power. He says, here in the spinal column they exist as extremely subtle vital centers of Prana Shakti and centers of consciousness. One of the Tantras also speaks of the lotuses as being strung on the Sushumna like beads on a thread. In speaking of the lotuses as being in these centers of the body, therefore this meaning or symbolic interpretation of the language must always be borne in mind. Now, this Kundalini force as it exists at the base of the spine is supposed to inhabit a three-dimensional world. That is a world like that in which we live. But when it enters the Sushumna, although it enters a definite space as we know it, it is supposed to enter a fourth-dimensional space. This is a very curious contradiction, apparently, but there is an odd biological analogy which seems to bear some relation to this point, and it is this. One of the great miracles of science is the nutrition of the body. How it is that a potato or a chicken which is running about, or a carrot or slice of bread can be little Mary Jones tomorrow, can somehow be turned into little Mary Jones, a part of her living body. The miracle of it is how. We know that this process of metabolism or food change and cell growth goes on all the time in the body. What happens to make this matter supplied to the body in the form of food become alive, part of the living body? We do not know, but we do know this, that if you examine the center of a cell with a high-powered microscope, there seems to be a double flow of material from the outside of the cell to the center, and then out again in the form of an ellipse. It starts from the outside of the cell, this matter, as pablum or food, that it reaches the center, and that center some changes take place whereby it becomes living. As it travels back, it becomes body. In this center, there seems to be a well of energy, welling up from nowhere, constant like a fountain which comes from no discernible source, and yet is always present, and it is this energy which vivifies matter. It is in space, and yet it seems to be spaceless. It comes from nowhere. Seizing upon foreign matter is an outwardly directed activity. Assimilation is an inwardly directed activity or return current. Cell division and multiplication is an outwardly directed operation. Coordination is inwardly directed, and so on. This outflow and inflow is a common tantric notion. You see then, there is this analogy between an interesting biological phenomenon and the Kundalini force, which while in 3 dimensions is said to enter 4 as it passes into the Sushumna. Just here we encounter the doctrine on the one hand of the 4th dimension, and on the other hand of more practical ways of awakening the Kundalini. The particular methods used, both of which subjects will be taken up. The Kundalini, the 4th dimension. We ended by stating that the Kundalini power, when it enters the passage in the spinal column called Sushumna, enters into a 4th dimensional sphere of activity. And we shall find that this 4th dimensional sphere is a sort of spiritual sphere, although it is, in a certain sense, it may be said to be in 3 dimensions too, as this 4th dimension figures so largely in our own psychic literature, as well as in Hindu literature. I think it may be well to obtain a clear conception as possible of what the 4th dimension really is before going further. If you take a point, that point is defined by Euclid as that which has no parts and no magnitude. It is supposed to be an infinitesimal point of departure and occupies no space in itself. Now, that point acting in a certain direction generates a line being said to be a number of points laid on end. One direction, one dimension. A direction is a dimension strictly speaking. Through the same point, if you draw another line at right angles to the first, you have a second direction or dimension, 2 dimensions. And there is a third way in which you can draw a line at right angles through that point at right angles to the other 2, and that is at right angles to the paper or blackboard, because on a flat surface or a 2-dimensional surface, you cannot draw the lines on it. These 3 directions, according to geometry, are the only 3 dimensions there are. The only ways in which you can draw a line at right angles to other lines through a given point. Take a square, 2 dimensions, length and breadth. If you add a 3rd dimension via height, you have a cube of 3 dimensions generated by moving at right angles to itself. Now, it ought to be possible to move in some direction at right angles to these 3 into a 4th dimension. In the same way that the 2nd dimension is at right angles to the 1st, the 3rd dimension is at right angles to the 2nd. The 4th dimension should be at right angles to the 3rd. Theoretically, there should be a 4th dimension, just as there are traditional 3. We know that in algebra it is easy to create a 4th dimension. We can write x to the 1, 1st dimension, x to the 2, x to the 3, etc. And it is just as easy to write x to the 4, x to the 5, x to the nth, as it is any other number or power. In mathematics, we can deal with 4 dimensions or any number of dimensions, but in geometry, it is difficult to do so. Moving at right angles to itself, a square would generate a cube, and that cube, moving at right angles itself, would generate a tesseract, which is a 4th dimensional figure generated by the movement of the cube, in the same way that a cube is created by the movement of a square, or the square is generated by the movement of a line. Each higher space is generated from the one lower, and we have calculated exactly what a tesseract should possess. It should have 16 corners, 32 edges, 24 square faces, and 8 bounding cubes, and it may be of interest to state in this connection that the geometry of the 4th dimension has been worked out so accurately. There is a large book by Professor Manning dealing with the geometry of 4 dimensions and explaining it in great detail. Probably you have heard a great deal regarding the connection between the 4th dimension and clairvoyance. The clairvoyant power, a certain kind of clairvoyance, enables you to see into the interior of a solid object. For instance, a person brings you a box and asks, "What is in there?" A clairvoyant can tell. You say, "How?" It is impossible to see into a box or anything which is sealed up in all directions. We can tell by analogy how that is possible. Let us suppose that a piece of paper is flat, world having 2 dimensions, a flat surface, and there are beings living on this 2-dimensional world who do not know anything about height, or the third dimension, only length and breadth. They are two-dimensional beings. In their consciousness, a third dimension could not enter. If you put a letter A inside of a square, that would be the room they are in. And an individual would live inside it. Another individual B outside the square would never be enabled to see inside unless there were a door made for him to enter, because he could never see that person from an elevated or higher space, because it does not exist for him a third space. But we can see this person by looking down on him from above into what to the two-dimensional being would be a closed space, the interior of a hermetically sealed room. We can see that person from outside because we can look down on him from above, see him from a third-dimensional viewpoint. To make the analogy clear, I see rings in a box because I look down on them from above. But if I could not look down on them from this upper height or space, I could never see them. By analogy from the fourth dimension, one could see down into the interior of what is to us a sealed space or room or box. In the same way that we see into a two-dimensional space from the third, the fourth dimensional being could see into a hermetically sealed room in the third. We can demonstrate many curious facts in connection with the fourth dimension. Take two pieces of paper, cut it in the form of triangles. Now, no matter how you move these triangles about, you cannot make them coincide in space. No matter what angle they take, you cannot make them coincide. But if you take one of them and turn it over in space and place it onto the second, you get the coincidence because you move into a third dimension. Take a left-handed glove. No matter how you turn it about, you cannot make a right-handed glove out of it. Yet you can turn this glove inside out and make a right-handed glove out of it. Theoretically, it is possible to turn a hollow rubber ball inside out without tearing it in the fourth dimension, in the same way that you turn the glove inside out in 3. Here is another very curious fact. Take a piece of string. You will find that as long as it is kept on a flat or two-dimensional surface, it is impossible to tie a true knot in it. In order to tie a knot in the string, you have to lift up one end over the other, and that is taking into the third dimension, which you are not entitled to do. As long as it is flat, kept in 2 dimensions, you cannot tie a knot in any string. Professor Zollner of Leipzig sealed the ends of a piece of cord onto his table, the rope being free from knots. The lights were turned down, and in the presence of Slade, the medium, a number of knots were found to be tied in the cord, which would be impossible to account for so long as the 2 ends of the cord were sealed. In our space, when you hold the 2 ends of a cord, you cannot tie a true knot in the string. You can tie a loop, but that is not what we want. You cannot tie a true knot in any of the pieces of the string when the ends are held. But Zollner said it is possible for the spirit, being a fourth dimensional being, to take that rope into the fourth dimension and in some way turn it over and produce a knot in it, in much the same manner that we can produce a knot by lifting this piece of string into the third dimension when tying it. On the basis largely of these experiments, he wrote his famous work on transcendental physics. If this fourth dimension really exists, it enables us to account for many psychic facts because it would permit us to attain a higher point of view from another dimension, which would allow us to look down into this world of ours from a higher state of mind. In the same way that we can look down on a two-dimensional world from a higher plane of consciousness and see what it is inside. In this way, we can account for clairvoyant diagnosis. A clairvoyant can look at a human being and say, your liver is out of order. How does he look at the interior of a body? Fourth dimensional sight. There is one other point in this connection which is interesting. You have just seen that a glove can be turned from a right to a left-handed by turning it inside out. The astral world is said to be, in one sense, a fourth dimensional world and to possess properties which that world possesses. It is also a mirror world. Look at a mirror, we stand in front of it, and it reflects our image, but the right and left hands are reversed, and all the movements of the body are reversed in the reflection. The distance an object is this side of the mirror appears to be the same distance on the other side of the mirror. If you hold 635 up to the mirror, it appears 536. If you have ever obtained mirror writing, which is sometimes produced automatically, it has to be held up to the mirror to be read. In Through the Looking Glass, Alice walked through the mirror and found herself in a looking glass world, and she found that everything was being done backwards. If she wanted to walk to the right, she must begin by running to the left as fast as she could, and she soon found herself on the right where she wanted to be. Everything was in that curiously reversed state, just as everything would be in a mirror world. Mr. Steiner has informed us that the astral world, which one might say is in some essentials a looking glass world until you know how to read it, has to be interpreted backwards. There are many other interesting facts which could be brought out in connection with the fourth dimension, but for our present purposes, I want only to bring out to the point that it has a distant relation to psychic phenomena, because it enables us to define certain powers, such as clairvoyance, which are not fully able to understand without the fourth dimensional space or sphere of activity. Of course, there are other theories of the fourth dimension, such as time, as Mr. H.G. Wells postulated. On the other hand, it has been objected that time is not four-dimensional, but one-dimensional. It has only length and nothing else. The theory has been advanced that life is a fourth-dimensional thing, and that it is through it passes through the world of matter, manifesting in various degrees and phases. That is a fourth-dimensional activity, because it comes from a higher sphere of being and thus manifests itself in different degrees. If you take a triangle and you make it pass through a plane or flat surface, as it passes through, you will see the different qualities which the triangle would manifest to a two-dimensional being. It would seem to enlarge and get bigger and then smaller and smaller until it would finally disappear. Now that is like life. It begins with a very little point and increases in breadth and power up to maturity, and then gradually diminishes down to the point where it becomes extinguished. But it has not gone into nothing. It is in the fourth dimension still. So the fourth dimension has been defined as truth, that which passes through a plane or a certain flat film of activity such as our world. That was the definition given by William James Sides in his lecture at Harvard University. He defined fourth dimension as truth. Let us now apply this to our yoga philosophy. The Kundalini power, when it passes into the Sushumna, is said to enter a mental world, this fourth dimensional world. And although it is existent in the three-dimensional world in one sense, inasmuch as it is definitely connected with the three-dimensional body, its activities are supersensate, superphysical, or fourth dimensional. And of course, the chakras are, as I have said before, composed of vital substance. Speaking of this point, Avalon says, the chakras, can be the objects of immediate perception only to yogis. Chakras proper, such as subtle, vital, and conscious centers in the spinal cord, are invisible to any but a yogi's vision. The yogi sees the chakras with his mental eye, or ajna. This Kundalini power then, after passing up the Sushumna and awakening the various chakras or psychic centers, in turn is said to create or generate or beget a new universe of activity, in the sense that it calls it into being. It brings into play, into activity, a new world, which has not existed until then. This is, in a sense, creation of a universe by the mating or union of matter and spirit. And this is what has symbolically been called the celestial marriage. It is the arousing of the Kundalini and its action on our material world. When we came to the practical part vis-a how to awaken this Kundalini power, we saw there were certain practices called Mudras, which consist in assuming certain bodily positions. Asana, practicing pranayama, getting so far as possible rhythm and harmony and balance, and concentrating definitely upon certain centers within the body, these centers being the chakras. That being done, the Kundalini power is awakened, vivifies the chakras, and you have all these siddhis or psychic powers which automatically come of themselves as it is awakened. Regarding the awakening of the Kundalini, Swami Vivekananda in his Raja Yoga says, after practicing this first breathing for a few days, you take up a higher one. Slowly fill the lungs with breath through the Ida, the left nostril. At the same time, concentrate the mind on the nerve current. You are, as it were, sending the nerve current down the spinal column and striking violently at the last plexus, the basic lotus, which is triangular in form. the seat of the Kundalini. Then hold the current there for some time. Imagine that you are slowly drawing that nerve current with the breath through the other side, then slowly throw it out through the right nostril. This you will find a little difficult to practice. The easiest way is to stop the right nostril with the thumb, and then slowly draw in the breath through the left. Then close both nostrils with thumb and forefinger and imagine that you are sending the current down and striking the base of the Sushumna, then taking the thumb off and let the breath out through the right nostril. Next, inhale slowly through that nostril, keeping the other closed by the forefinger, then close both as before. It is well to begin with 4 seconds and slowly increase. Draw in 4 seconds, hold in 16 seconds, then throw out in 8 seconds. This makes one pranayama. At the same time, think of the triangle. Concentrate the mind on that center. The imagination can help you a great deal. The next breathing is slowly drawing the breath in and then immediately throwing it out slowly and then stopping the breath out using the same numbers. The only difference is that in the first case, the breath was held in, and in the second, held out. The last one is the easier one. The breathing in which you hold the breath in the lungs must not be practiced too much. One day, if you practice hard, the Kundalini will be aroused. Now, as you're practicing pranayama and the necessary concentration to awaken the Kundalini, certain forces will begin to develop, certain phenomena will begin to be observed. One of them is the peculiar internal sound which you will notice. This is called the voice of the nada. The Hindus claim that this sacred voice of the nada is heard internally, that it is the voice of silence or the soundless sound, of which so much has been written and so much mystery has been made. It is this voice or this sound which is soundless to an outsider, but which is distinctly heard by the person himself. Says H.B. Blavatsky, he who would hear the voice of the nada, the soundless sound, and comprehend it, has to learn the nature of Dharma. When to himself his form appears unreal, as do on waking all forms we see in dreams. When he has ceased to hear the many, he may discern the one, the inner sound which kills the outer. For then the soul will hear and will remember, and then to the inner ear will speak the voice of the silence. And now thyself is lost in self, thyself unto thyself, merged in that self from which thou first didst radiate. Behold, thou hast become the light, thou hast become the sound, thou art thy master and thy God, thou art thyself, the object of thy search, the voice unbroken that resounds throughout eternities, exempt from change, from sin exempt, the 7 sounds in one, the voice of the silence, Om Tat Sat. These sounds, or phenomenal acoustic manifestations, have been classified. Madame Blavatsky again, in the voice of the silence, lists them as follows. First, a nightingale. Second, the sound of a cymbal. Third, the ocean spirit in a shell, sound of rushing waters. Fourth, the chant of Vens, an Indian stringed instrument like a lute. Fifth, a bamboo flute. Sixth, a trumpet blast. Seventh, dull thunder, rumbling. 8, you pass through all those and you attain silence, which is the silence we wish to attain, the pearl of great price, which has been obtained after passing through these ordeals in order to obtain these phenomena. When you arrive at this supreme attainment, other writers have said that you hear buzzing sounds, the sounds of a lute or of a harp, of a bell. Apropos, this you will remember the astral bell which Madame Blavatsky produced. The sound of waves of thunder, the hum of the bee, of a drum, and finally silence. This drum sound is generally heard in the ajna chakra between the eyes. Now, if you were frankly to ask me what degree of objectivity I should attach to these sounds, what they signify, I should be inclined to think that they have a physiological basis. They are due to 2 causes. One is the pressure of the blood, which, as we know, will produce singing in the ears and other sounds. And the second, and more important, is the fact that by the intense practice of pranayama, tiny air bubbles find their way into the blood and, traveling through the circulation, produce these extraordinary sounds. Of course, I think that associated with these sounds occur very often extraordinary psychic phenomena. But personally, I should be inclined to think that these sound phenomena have not any particular spiritual significance, but rather are the result of certain physiological phenomena going on in the body. To return to the point, how to arouse the Kundalini power, Swami Vivekananda in his Raja Yoga has a paragraph on this, and in fact has been criticized quite extensively for giving so much information because some said it could cause harm. I've always felt that many people are great cowards when it comes to matters psychic. For in the same way that you never make any definite advance in physics or chemistry or any other science without experimenting, trying things out, in the same way you do not make any advances in psychics unless you experiment. When I was working in yoga systematically, people would say to me, "Oh, it's all right. You'll become insane. You'll have trouble with your lungs and your mind by following these pranayama exercises. You'll become insane eventually." And I would reply, "All right, I will become insane, but I'm going to do these exercises." And I did them. And I don't think I am insane. At least I hope not. The point is, I think there is very little danger in giving these exercises to people because practically no one has the persistence to follow them out. It requires great practice and concentration for months and months to obtain enough results to be detrimental to anybody, and by that time, you've had enough experience to do them properly. Swami Vivekananda says, prana means the vital forces in one's own body. Yama means controlling them. There are 3 sorts of pranayama: the very simple, the middle, and the very high. The whole of pranayama is divided into 2 parts. One is called filling, the other is called emptying the lungs. When you begin with 12 seconds in the lowest pranayama, when you begin with 24 seconds in the middle pranayama, that pranayama is the best, which begins with 36 seconds. That pranayama in which there is first perspiration, then vibration of the body, then rising from the seat and joining of the man's soul with great bliss, is the highest pranayama. Fixing the mind on the lotus of the heart or on the center of the head, this is called dharana. As a matter of fact, dharana is not limited to that. You can concentrate on other things. Dhyana is spoken of, and a few examples given of what to meditate upon. Sit straight and look at the tip of your nose. Later on, we will come to know how that concentrates the mind, how by controlling the 2 optic nerves, one advances a long way towards the control of the arc of reaction, and so to control of the will. These are a few specimens of meditation. Imagine a lotus upon the top of the head, several inches up, and virtue as its center, the stalk as knowledge. The 8 petals of the lotus are the 8 powers of the yogi. Inside the stamens and pistils are renunciation. If the yogi refuses the external powers, he will come to salvation. So the 8 petals of the lotus are the 8 powers, but the internal stamens and pistils are the extreme renunciation, the renunciation of all these. Inside of the lotus, think of the golden one, the almighty, the intangible, he whose name is Om, the inexpressible, surrounded with effulgent light. Meditate on that. Another meditation is given. Think of a space in your heart, and in the midst of that space, think that a flame is burning. Think of that flame as your own soul, and inside that flame is another space, effulgent, and that is the soul of your soul, God. Meditate upon that in your heart. Of the 2 great sources of information concerning these inner mystic practices of the yogis, the Shiva Samhita is strangely silent. It gives almost no information of value regarding the awakening of the Kundalini. The Hatha Yoga principle, however, is more precise. Here we read, as Ananta, the Lord of Serpents, supports this whole universe with his mountains and forest, so Kundalini is the main support of all the yoga practices. When Kundalini is sleeping, it is aroused by the favor of the Guru, and then all the lotuses and granthis are pierced. Then prana goes through the royal road, Sushumna. Then the mind remains suspended, and then the yogi cheats death. He who with upturned face and tongue, closing the hole in the palate, contemplate upon Kundalini, and drinks the clear waves of the stream of nectar, following from the moon in the head into the 16-petaled lotus in the throat. Through the control over prana, during the Hatha Yoga practice, this yogi is freed from all diseases and lives long with a body soft and beautiful as the fibers of a lotus stem. The Kundalini is described as being coiled like a serpent. He who causes that Shakti to move is freed without doubt. You should awaken the sleeping serpent Kundalini by taking hold of his tail. Between the Ganges and the Humuna, there sits a young widow inspiring pity. He should despoil her forcibly, for it leads one to the supreme seat of Vishnu. Ida is the sacred Ganges and Pingala, the Humuna. Between Ida and Pingala, there sits the young widow Kundalini. Seated in the Vajrayana posture, firmly take hold of the feet near the ankles and slowly beat with them the Khanda. Assuming the Vajrasana posture, the yogi should cause the Kundalini to move. He should then perform the Bhastrika Kumbhaka. Thus he will soon awaken the Kundalini. He should then contract the sun near the navel and cause the Kundalini to move. Even though he be in the mouth of death, he need not fear it. Contracting the stomach contracts the sun. By moving the Kundalini fearlessly for about an hour and a half, she is drawn upwards a little through the Sushumna. By this process, Kundalini certainly leaves open the mouth and the prana goes naturally through it. Only a yogi leading the life of a celibate and observing a moderate and nutritious diet obtains perfection in the manipulation of Kundalini within 45 days. Having set the Kundalini in motion, he should practice the Bhastrika Kumbhaka constantly. The person perfected in yama and practicing this need never fear death. Arthur Avalon in The Serpent Power says, the principle of all the methods to attain samadhi is to get the prana out of the Ida and Pingala. When this is achieved, these nadis become dead because vitality has gone out of them. The prana then enters Sushumna, and after piercing by the aid of Kundalini, the 6 chakras in the Sushumna become laya or absorbed in the Sahasrara. The means to this end, when operating from the Muladhara, seem to vary in detail, but embody a common principle, namely the forcing of prana downward and the apana upwards, that is, the reverse of their natural directions, by the Jalandhara and Mulabandha, or otherwise, when by their union the internal fire is increased. The position is thus similar to a hollow tube in which a piston is working at both ends without escape of the central air, which thus becomes heated. Then the serpent force Kundalini, aroused by this heat thus generated, is aroused from her potential state called sleep, in which she lies coiled up. She then hisses and straightens herself and enters the Sushumna, when by further repeated efforts the chakras in the Sushumna are pierced. The whole sum and substance of the Mudras, as a matter of fact, is simply this, that one must, while sitting in asana and practicing the pranayama, concentrate on the chakras in turn, beginning with the lowest and meditating on that, and then on the next, and then on the next above it, and so on until the 7 have been passed through. The first stage is to endeavor to feel the position of the lotuses in the body, to become as sensitive and receptive as possible, and then to feel, if possible, where that center is. As the center of consciousness is shifted, you begin to feel a stirring. You should then hold it there, meditate on that spot, and then will that center shall be aroused by the psychic energy which is being directed to that particular center. The point is, you should not try to develop purely telepathy, purely clairvoyance, purely astral projection, purely psychic phenomena, but rather to arouse Kundalini by certain methods of life, mental and physical, psychic and spiritual. And when that is awakened, automatically all these psychic powers will come to you. As proper progress is made in awakening this power, these other psychic phenomena will come of themselves, of their own accord. Then you will find that you are able to levitate yourself, or project the astral body, to read other people's minds, to control animals, or to come invisible, or any of the numerous things which you have read about. The process of arousing Kundalini may then be summarized thus. Physical and mental exercises of a specific character arouse this power, and the power once aroused vivifies in turn the various chakras. Sitting in the prescribed asana, the mind is steadied by a suitable mudra, and pranayama is begun. The air is inhaled and retained, kumbhaka, being forced downward in the body against the lower pranic currents, which are at the same time forced upwards by contraction of the anal muscles. Concentration during this early period has so far been upon ajna, but it is now shifted to the heart center, and the thought image of a flame is held in the mind existing in this center. This is now mentally projected downwards to the lowest center, the Muladhara. Internal heat or fire is thereby generated, which arouses Kundalini. Thereupon she becomes active, pierces the opening into the Sushumna, and proceeds upwards to the second center where she vivifies, and so on until all are finally aroused. The mere awakening of the centers, however, does not in itself ensure liberation. Even when Kundalini has reached and vivified the topmost chakra, Sahasrata, this is not ensured. There is a constant tendency on the part of the Kundalini to return to its starting point, and work must be incessant. Only when Kundalini takes up her permanent abode in Sahasrata is a liberation attained. It is said that great psychic powers are ensured to the yogi who can hold Kundali Shakti in this center for 3 days and 3 nights steadily. Great care must be taken to guide the Kundalini safely back again at the close of meditation to its center at the base of the spine. For as Avalon says, the return of Kundalini is the setting again of the Tivatma in the phenomenal world of the lowest plane of being, after it had been raised, therefore, in a state of ecstasy or samadhi. The Kundalini is therefore, as a rule, led back to Anatta, the heart center, retained there during a period of meditation, and then led down again to the lowest center whence it started. The ease with which this process is accomplished depends partly upon the will of the yogi and partly upon the purity of the nadis. It must not be thought, however, that the object of arousing Kundalini is merely to produce or induce psychic phenomena. On the contrary, its prime object is to attain cosmic consciousness. Thereby, the rousing and stirring up of Kundalini in Kundali Yoga is a form of that merger of the individual into the universal consciousness, which is the end of every system of Indian yoga. It is said indeed that the form of union so attained is more complete than any other, and that samadhi, attained through dhyana, pure meditation, or without arousing the Kundalini, is not so perfect or so blissful. The Kundalini is the individualized expression of the great cosmic power, and the reunion or merger of the microcosm into the macrocosm represents the goal of attainment. In one sense, of course, the Hindu philosophy is a selfish philosophy, simply the development of self. But is not all religion, Christianity included, selfish in the last analysis? As Hereward Carrington says, religion and morality under the commercial regime became, as was natural, perfectly selfish. It was always, am I saved? Am I doing the right thing? Am I winning the favor of God and man? Will my claims to salvation be allowed? Did I make a good bargain in allowing Jesus to be crucified for me? And we read that doing good to others is the supreme duty in the primary stages of yoga. The whole aim of yoga is to arrive at this state of harmony, of internal balance or adjustment, which is also the great aim of magic and mystical practices, to equilibrate the forces within the body to those without, to adjust the vibrations, the general forces within the body to the external cosmos. And when that has been brought about, then you have harmony and happiness. There are many people who, when you mention samadhi or cosmic consciousness, will say, oh, that is all hallucination. You're in a morbid, abnormal state through these concentrations, breathing exercises, and so forth. You get into a sort of semi-anesthetic condition where anything appears real to you, in which state you deceive yourself as in dreams. But the Hindu says, no, it is a true state. It is as real as anything in the world, and if you do not believe it, experience it yourself, and then you will believe it. The psychologist says, no, I cannot experience this. I want an objective outside proof. And the Hindu says, you can't have that objective outside proof. Experience it, then you will know. So there is this irreconcilable conflict between the two schools, the objective and the subjective. One says, you must know from inner experience, and the other says, I must know from outside experience. And you cannot settle this argument unless you have enough of the inner experience to know that what the Hindu says is true. Of course, the Hindus, like all Orientals, are flowery in their language. They are bombastic. They claim a great deal, and they say many things which appear to be rubbish, and a great many things which doubtless are rubbish, such as living forever, and he who does this is immune from all diseases, and so on. Nevertheless, they possess great knowledge and know great truths. This brings me to my last point, which is this. There are 3 schools of psychic development in existence. the yoga, which we've been discussing, the occult, and the purely mediumistic or psychic. Yoga philosophy we have now studied and know a good deal about. The mediumistic or psychic you probably know a good deal about also. Mediums depend upon becoming receptive or passive and allowing influences to play through the organism and assume control. I have given a fairly complete account of these methods in my book, Your Psychic Powers and How to Develop Them. The occultists, the representatives of the occult, say that is wrong. This extreme passivity, this extreme receptivity to influences is not a good thing for the human ego. It allows influences to play on and through you which are not helpful. You don't know what they are. It is to be discouraged. And that I think they're very largely right. I think extreme mediumistic and psychic development is not helpful, and that the occultist is often correct in that point of view. You should retain a consciousness of self, a control of the ego during psychic experiences, and this control can be obtained by yoga practices, which, as you see, are a sort of halfway house between the Eastern and Western schools. It is hard to say just what is right and what is wrong in all these three methods of development, but in the same way that in observing an exciting event, you become lost in the excitement, and in the event, and in a certain sense, lose self, yet in another sense, you do not lose the sense of self. So in the same way, in samadhi, in cosmic consciousness, you experience this mystical state, become one with the superconsciousness, but at the same time, you retain your own consciousness, experiencing the one without losing the other. This is hard to explain, but theoretically, there should be a merging into the higher consciousness while retaining the self as a background without the feeling of self. And that is these 2 chapters on Kundalini by Hereward Carrington. As you can see, it's very different and unusual and very thorough reading of the literature at the time and what we know about the Kundalini. And the real takeaway from this is it can be hard. It's difficult. It takes time. I get a lot of people that say, hey man, I tried your meditation, didn't work. My Kundalini didn't get awakened. And I get it. You know, some people are lucky. They do experience the Kundalini very quickly. But others, it's very difficult. And it's hard for me to do some of these positions and breathing exercises. It's tough. But through experimentation and work, give yourself 3 months. I think that you will awaken the Kundalini. And you don't need to develop psychic powers. Your psychic powers will develop when you awaken the Kundalini. I think that Dr. Joe has scientifically helped us to understand this. Dr. Joe Dispenza's book talks about this energy moving up through the tightening of the perineum muscles, very much like it is here. There are definitely exercises and positions and breathing exercises which work specifically to awaken the Kundalini. Alternating the nostril breath is one that has worked very well for me, but I still haven't done enough. I've experienced the Kundalini state, but as it says here, it goes away. You need to continue to work on raising it and keeping it, and I will continue to do that. This is not something for people that want a super fast, easy way to do it. This takes a little bit of time, but I think it's worth it. And looking at these older books helps us to understand what happens. And I'll definitely try to look into The Serpent Power by Avalon as a future reading. I would love to get your comments. Have you experienced a Kundalini? What was it like when you experienced it? How long did it take? What sort of exercises did you do to awaken the Kundalini? Did anybody experience what they thought was a Kundalini and later thought, well, you know what, that wasn't? When Neville Goddard talks about the crack in his head, was that the Kundalini? These are questions that I have, and I'm going to continue to explore different literature. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope it expands your knowledge of the Kundalini and what may be required for us to awaken it. All episodes of The Reality Revolution can easily be found at therealityrevolution.com. You can get a free copy of this book at theimlibrary.com. Just look up Hereward Carrington, Hereward, Carrington, Carrington, Higher Psychical Development, That's what you got to look up and you'll find it. There is a bunch of books that he wrote, and we'll definitely be going over these. I have so much to read in the future, and I'm so excited to share it with you. I love you guys so very much. Welcome to the Reality Revolution.